promise there will be time to network after the event as well. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Marzak, the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for this incredibly timely and I think also incredibly insightful conversation on Venezuela post-UN General Assembly. President Solis, great you could join us. Minister Walcott of Barbados, Minister of Foreign Affairs, great you could join us. Looking for any ministers other ministers that might be in the room. Don't see any. I want to also recognize Adrienne Arsht, the founder of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, who's here with us today. Thank you so much, Adrienne. Adrienne's vision is the reason that we're all here, and not only her vision, but her inspiration for me and the rest of my team on a regular basis. I also want to give a welcome who just walked into the room to Minister Stuart Young, the Minister of National Security of Trinidad and Tobago. Last week, among other things, we saw renewed momentum around resolving the Venezuela crisis in New York, and this is imperative. We cannot let status quo set in. I think that is critical. And this morning, we held a 3-hour crisis simulation with our partners at Foreign Policy Magazine and Florida International University on the potential reverberations of state collapse in Venezuela. This is unfortunately a very real scenario and one we must avoid, and that became even clearer this morning. Today's discussion will focus on the necessary new momentum to do something we are laser focused on at the Atlantic Council, which is accelerating a peaceful, democratic transition in Venezuela, and what could or should now be on the table in light of the continued threats to regional and global stability. I'd like to thank Foreign Policy and Florida International University for their incredible partnership and all of our activities for today, and of course thank my team, Paula Tufro, Domingo Sarduni, Diego Area, Angela Chavez, and the rest of the team for all of their incredible work on today's discussion. I'm going to turn over to Brian Fonseca of FIU and then Andrew Solinger of FP, and then I'm going to come back up and moderate a conversation on steps the international community should or could take to coordinate a global action plan to avert further threats to regional global stability. Also, feel free to get out your phones, but not to WhatsApp or to send emails, but to tweet about how interesting this event is. And when you're doing this, so please use the hashtag ACVenezuela. Brian Fonseca, Florida International University, welcome.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I want to underscore Jason's comments. Certainly there is no other more consequential crisis going on in the region than what we're seeing in Venezuela. And so FIU is incredibly humbled and honored to be a part of this morning's event and to be a partner with Foreign Policy Magazine and the Adrienne Arsht Center. And so Jason, really grateful for you and all your team has done to bring us here. I'd be remiss if I didn't also send some thank yous out to the folks at FIU that have really worked tirelessly to make sure that we got everybody into town and that we made certain that this afternoon's or this morning's event was a success. I'd also like to recognize, I believe we have in the room, our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense, Sergio de la Peña, in the room. So I want to recognize him and thank him for being in attendance today. And again, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So with that, I'll quickly turn it over to Andrew. Thank you very much.
Just to keep the thanks rolling, thank you so much, Brian. And Jason, I just wanted to remark that on behalf of Foreign Policy, we were so thrilled to run this simulation this morning. We've done these peace game simulations around the world over the past several years. And Jonathan Tepperman and I, our editor-in-chief who ran the simulation for us, were just discussing what an incredibly involved, engaged, and meaningful group of participants we had, how they really had thoughtful contributions, really, really helpful. Jason, we started talking about this. I looked at my calendar actually this morning. It was exactly 8 months ago. So we have to move more quickly. We obviously have a great partnership and a great team. And we're very pleased to be partnering with the Atlantic Council, with FIU. And Adrienne, thank you so much for bringing us all together. And I too really look forward to the discussion today. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks. Please go ahead. Thanks, Brian and Andrew. As every folks are getting to the stage, it's a great pleasure of mine to welcome 5 extremely insightful speakers for our discussion. I'm going to go ahead and introduce each of them briefly and then sit down and join them. First to my left here is President Luis Guillermo Solis. He served as president of the Republic of Costa Rica from 2014 to 2018. President Solis has contributed to strengthening Central America's political institutions, economies, and ties to the rest of the world. And you also now can add to your resume, you are now a visiting fellow or visiting professor at Florida International University. So welcome, President Solis. Next to President Solis is Ambassador Marcelo Jaco de Vink. He is the director of the Western Hemisphere Department in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Among his previous roles, you've also served, I saw, as ambassador to Pakistan. So we will not talk about Pakistan today, but don't worry, I will keep, of course, all the questions focused on Latin America. Next to him, Minister Jocelyn Creuez, who is the Minister Plenipotentiary for Aruba in the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. She focuses in her role on creating opportunities for Aruba here in the United States. So one of those opportunities will be having all of us to go travel to Aruba, I think at some point as well. Next to her is Victor Bautista. Victor is the Director of Development and Border Integration in the Colombian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In just the last year, Victor, I was looking, you've overseen the numerous border corridors, both on the Venezuelan and on the Ecuadorian borders. Victor, you were just in Cucuta, I think, this past week.
Yes.
And if anyone wants to see how dire the situation is, Victor has a video he can show of what he saw just a few days ago in Cucuta. Welcome, Victor. Next to Victor is Ambassador Gustavo Tarde. Ambassador Tarde is the ambassador to the Organization of American States of the Interim Government of Venezuela. Before being recognized as ambassador this spring, he was a longtime professor and also has served as a Venezuelan legislator. And actually, Ambassador Tarde, you're joining us coming straight from the OAS. So great, you could join us. A quick housekeeping note, we're going to have some fun up here and conduct the discussion both in English and in Spanish. So if you don't have translation, raise your hand. People will walk around. Keep your hands raised until you have translation equipment, and people will walk around and bring that translation. I actually don't need it, so I'll put my hand down. But everyone else, please keep your hands up, and that translation equipment will come. And we're going to go ahead and we'll get started. Don't worry, we'll go ahead and get started in English. So as that translation equipment is coming, don't worry, you have a few moments for that to come to you. I'm going to go ahead and sit down and join the panel here. President Solis, we often focus on how the Venezuela crisis is affecting the direct neighbors, including Caribbean islands. I'm glad that we have Caribbean participation here. But your country and the rest of the region sees the implications as well. What is the biggest concern for the region as a whole if complacency and inaction settle in following last week's UN General Assembly meetings?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. In fact, I think that the biggest concern is escalation. We've seen it, in other cases. We saw it this morning, the possibility of the Venezuelan situation blowing up in a chaotic way. And that's why international intervention of different kinds, we're talking of not military intervention, but intervention that would be constructive in solving or addressing at least some of the agenda issues there, is so pressing. What we're seeing is a combination of humanitarian and political and security crisis overlapping one with the other. And in fact, it's very difficult to disengage one area from another, but undoubtedly the humanitarian crisis is what keeps us more concerned, particularly because of the large amount of Venezuelans that have left the country. Costa Rica itself has received its quota of immigrants. It's not as large as Colombia's or Ecuador's or Peru's, but still we can fathom, the human costs of this of the actions of this horrible regime that has pushed the people out. Again, I think that escalation would be the biggest threat, and it's not far away. We should move urgently, and not, as you say, we should not release our attention on the Venezuelan case, which is something we could very easily do.
Yeah, and Ambassador de Vink, in terms of area, Venezuela is the largest neighbor of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, with Aruba and Curacao. We'll hear more on Aruba, just off the Venezuelan coast. My question to you is,
following this broad support, as President Solis mentions, the importance of not letting complacency settle in and what could be the implications of that for the region. But following the broad support the interim government received last week in New York, what steps would the Kingdom of the Netherlands like the international community to take in an optimal scenario to really help to prevent some of these increasing effects that you're seeing on the kingdom?
No, thanks very much, Jason, and thanks for this opportunity. Thanks also to Foreign Policy and the FIU and the Atlantic Council for doing what you did this morning. That was I think, a great success. On your question, I think during the peace game, it demonstrates that we have to keep at the crisis. This is a multifaceted crisis in many different ways that is impacting us hugely, as you said, also as directly. So we have a great interest to keep up the pressure. So we were happy with coming out of the UN last week that there was a strong support for the interim government. It was also important that the EU adopted targeted sanctions added to the list. That was in response to the strong human rights violations. That's something that we need to continue to do. Of course, sanctions can be reversed if there's progress on democracy and human rights. And I think most importantly, we've seen the efforts of Norway to conduct talks. Now, they've broken down, but the international community needs to shape the conditions to resume those talks. There is no real alternative to that. And we need to make sure that the international community, whether it's the European Union, the United States, the International Contact Group, the Lima Group, all those actors are actually aligned. I think we can make progress there. There's been a proliferation because of the huge concern of the crisis, proliferation of these efforts. We need to make sure that these are all aligned. So also in that respect, I think it was very productive, the UNGA meeting last week.
So just a quick follow-up question. You said what steps should the international community take? I think your answer I'm hearing is alignment, and we need continued alignment. And you're saying that the announcement of additional sanctions from the European Union perspective is critical in that regard.
Yeah. I think we need to build the pressure. We've not just said that we would respond with additional pressure in response to further breaches of human rights violations, but we've also said that if there are no credible, we want those talks. But if these are not credible, they are not serious, then we're also looking at additional targeted sanctions.
Mr. Cruz, before going to you, I'm going to switch to Spanish. So hopefully everyone has their translation at this point. Victor. Dinero adicional para ayudar a los países de la región con respecto a la ola de venezolanos es imperativo, ¿no? Y la semana pasada, nuestro
is essential. And last week, our task force, the Atlantic Council, United States, Colombia, sounded a call to international donors to help Colombia. We also suggested that the United States needs to support Colombia with more technology on the border. My question for you is the following. What is the best assistance the United States could provide to Colombia at this time after the most recent commitment of $120 million in additional funding for Colombia and Venezuela and the entire region? Undoubtedly, this migration crisis has a complexity that we can't break apart. The need for assistance and public health is key. We're seeing child mortality and problems in Venezuela, and that's going to grow in the region. This is impacted by the migration. So health is an essential component. We have to increase that type of assistance. It can't be the only thing. However, stabilization of the migrant populations in our countries. If we're not able to stabilize these flows, we're going to see more xenophobia, more violence. The importance of the education system absorbing young migrants. Through education systems, I think it's about 40% that are being absorbed right now. But there are new components to regulate the necessary security. We have to have strengthened borders to identify the migrant populations, characterize them, and to not allow that negative elements threaten safety and security in Latin America. If we start to see criminal activities and resistance by local communities, we're going to see a wave of resistance in all of the countries. And this is not going to help to protect migrants. We need technology for identification and registration, profiling, and we're going to have this security component. This is going to be very important in this phase of the migration crisis.
Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center account on Twitter, we just put out a video on the contributions of Venezuelan migrants and refugees in Peru. Y me parece tan importante, Victor, que hacemos todo lo posible para enfrentar
That we need to do
esta
everything
posible
possible
ola de xenofobia.
to tackle this possible wave of xenophobia against Venezuelan migrants. Ambassador Tare, last week in New York, what we saw invoked is the Rio Treaty. This is on reciprocal assistance. What are the real implications of the Rio Treaty? And I wanted to note to the public that you are spearheading some of these efforts when it comes to the Rio Treaty. So that's why I think it's so important to ask you this question. What are the real implications? And what are the options for the Rio Treaty? If it's sort of coercive actions, military actions. Thank you, Jason. First, I wanted to apologize for not being in the simulation exercise this morning. I wanted to thank the organizers for the invitation. My question, Jason, it's very difficult to answer you in just a couple moments, but I will try to do so briefly.
After World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War, the countries of the Western Hemisphere came together to develop a treaty of mutual assistance. And as countries came out from under the British crown, they chose not to sign other than Bahamas and Trinidad and Tobago. But Venezuela, Mexico, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua did sign it. So originally, it was meant to be for the full hemisphere, but only 19 countries ended up signing on. Cuba certainly never expressed any interest in membership. What was the purpose of the Rio Treaty? To defend the countries of the hemisphere against external aggression. And there are two modalities included. One is a direct attack, and that doesn't require much interpretation. But the other, Article 6, calls for the treaty to be invoked when there is a threat against the sovereignty or peace of one of the member nations. And it is that clause that we invoked. And from Venezuela's perspective, we're working on two fronts. The domestic front, there, it was the National Assembly and the opposition movements that expressed support. And this is quite a broad array of different segments of society that go through, that include Guaidó, Nuevo Tiempo, Primero Justicia, Antonio Ledesma, and many other parties and individuals. So it's a national front to invoke the treaty, and we did receive the support of all these different entities. And the second front was to build a coalition amongst the states party to the treaty, which wasn't as easy as you might think. You might have thought, oh, that'll be easy because so many countries support Guaidó. But as you know, countries have their own interests, their own domestic issues and domestic challenges when it comes to the use of force as well. So it was a slow process to build up this coalition. We had 12 votes to invoke the treaty. An amendment proposed by Costa Rica, proposing to exclude the use of force. That resolution was rejected by the advisory body, not because the other members were interested in a use of force, but just on the basis of the fact that you couldn't impose any specific course of action on the foreign ministers, their meetings. At this point, there are 16 votes. What we're missing there is Cuba, Trinidad and Tobago, and Uruguay. So that was, any other comments I can leave to my second time at the mic. Well, what's the next step? Well, we had 2 months during which the consultative body and would meet with the states party to this OAS system to discuss implementation of what was agreed. So first there is preparing a list of human rights violators, corrupt elements that have enriched themselves by stealing from Venezuela, those involved in drug trafficking and terrorism, putting together all the elements that are threatening the peace and who the people are who could potentially be extradited, prosecuted. So it's quite a range of people. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Illegality coming out of Venezuela as we think about post-UNGA, and I think one of the messages you're getting from this discussion as well as the importance of avoiding any type of stasis. Minister Croas, at least if my numbers are correct here, 90% of the gold that leaves Aruba originally came from Venezuela's Arco Minero, which is a gold-rich region covering about 12% of the country. It's mined in Venezuela by state actors, criminal groups, guerrilla groups. Shipments are delivered by boat or flown to the islands. There's paperwork that's oftentimes presented that the gold was legally mined in another country, whereas it wasn't legally mined. It's then flown to other countries, flown to Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Switzerland, other countries to be refined and sold in banks. My question for you is, this is one aspect of the illegality coming out of Venezuela. We talk a lot about the drug trade, we talk about human trafficking, all of which we'll touch on this panel. But how does this affect Aruba, and what are the lessons that you would share for other Caribbean islands?
Before I start answering this question, maybe it's good to understand the situation of Aruba
Please.
with Venezuela. Aruba is an island in the Caribbean with a population of 100,000, and we do have more than 10% of the illegal Venezuelans are now in Aruba. The same in Curacao, the island of Curacao. On a good day, we can see Punto Fijo clearly from Aruba. It's that close to Aruba. We have had always very good relationships with Venezuela. Most of our fruits and vegetables came from Venezuela. So what happened was in the early 2018, the Venezuela government, they accused the islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, of illegal transportation of Venezuelan golds. The island itself didn't really see the impact of it because whatever was happening to the free zone. But when this happened, they closed the borders. Venezuela closed the borders with Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire. And the effect that it had on the island was that from one day to the other, we had no fruits and vegetables. So we had to find a quick solution for that. So you don't realize how dependent you are when you have that kind of relationship with, we call a sister country of a party. With the closing of after some changes that we made in our regulations, it opened back the borders, which now is closed again. Aruba, in any case, in July 2019, we implemented a complete ban on import, transport, and export on Venezuela gold and metal. So that solved, in any case, that problem.
And how does that illegal? I mean, how does this continue to affect the island's policies, the threats of the illegality coming from Maduro?
The gold one, we don't see it anymore because it's an island. So you can either come by boat or by plane, but most of these, from what I understood, they came just by the legal channels, by plane, and they had the proper documents. There was even a court case in Aruba, and the company that was doing this won the case because his paperwork seemed okay. But now with the banning, we don't have this issue. What we do see happening now is per week, we see some 2 to 3 the speed boats, what we call the fast boats, coming in now with we call human trafficking, drug trafficking, and guns. That's so the gun is we don't have that problem, but we see other problems coming up.
Yeah. Now, President Solis, we just concluded as we were referring to a peace game that looked at the many reverberations of state collapse. I'm not going to ask you to reveal the outcomes of that. That was a conversation where the outcomes will be released, Andrew, through Foreign Policy magazine in the near future. So a little a plug to stay tuned for Foreign Policy for your next print issue, as well as online for the outcomes of that, as well as the Atlantic Council and FIU. But I would like to continue to focus on trafficking that's emanating out of Venezuela. The minister was talking about gold. We were also talking about human smuggling, arms trafficking. How might a deepening of the crisis, and again, putting on our hats on the need for a global action plan to avoid any type of inaction settling in, how might a deepening of the crisis reverberate not just to Costa Rica, given your larger profile, you're not on the rest of the region, in terms of the illegality that's coming out of this? How do you see this, a deepening of the crisis affecting the region more broadly?
Well, actually, it worsens the situation. I mean, we have to admit that the whole Caribbean basin has been plagued by illegal activities for decades, and the situation in Venezuela is only making it worse. The thing that troubles me particularly is that the drug networks are providing the regime in Venezuela and, the drug networks and international crime in general networks are providing the regime with resources it badly needs to keep its operations going. So, the rogue military groups, the different repressive bodies that exist in Venezuela are profiting from this. So many of the good things that the international community has been able to put in place, like specific sanctions on individuals that are considered to be violators of human rights or are recognized rogue elements within the international community, are being undermined by these criminal networks. So the whole effort that we have to put up to control these networks continues, and now it has to be enhanced. The thing is, the drug networks are being used by all sorts of other criminal activities. So they were already in place. So now Venezuela is just, cashing on them, and in my perspective, only making it more difficult by the fact that Colombia is again producing such large amounts of drugs that it's overwhelming the neighboring countries' capacities to neutralize that. So my response in short would be the Venezuelan chaos is adding up to the already very serious situation of international crime in the region, and it could bring about more activities in areas such as human trafficking or weapons trafficking, which is something we have feared for a long, long time. Costa Rica obviously is part of that. Unfortunately, we're not an exception in being part of that traffic, and also developing structures within the country that have been very detrimental to our internal security.
So, Ambassador Vink, President Solis just mentioned the disastrous implications for the region already because of the criminality, but also what we could potentially expect moving forward as well. And so, as we always like to think about action and solutions, I guess I have a two-part question to you. First is what eventualities, and this could be then for the others as well. First, what eventualities is the Netherlands concerned about in regard to Venezuelan criminal organizations using the Dutch islands as an entry point into the broader kingdom, whether it's for drug trafficking or other types of nefarious activities? Not just your concern and what actions are being taken, but then also in an optimal scenario, what type of action would you like to see be led by the international community?
So I very much share the concerns as expressed by President Solis. It's something, we are catching up. This is we know this is a problem that has been long there, but it's increasing, and it's really expanding very fast. There's a lot of export of instability out of Venezuela. There's no mistake about that. So what we're looking at is increasing, and this is within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, of course. So within the Kingdom, we are looking at different kinds of responses. It's not just because it's illegal arms, etc., that is affecting us, but also, we know that also there's a business model behind illegal migration. That's something that needs to be countered. So we're discussing that. Externally, we always had a presence to counter, for instance, also the increase of drugs into directly also into the Netherlands and Europe. There's been a threefold increase over the past 2 years or so. So that's tremendous. But what so we had an effort in the region, but we're trying to optimize that by expanding cooperation with governments in the region. But also we have our Navy deployed in the area, so we're making sure that the Coast Guard that we have, but also the Navy effort is increasingly better equipped to deal with this incredible challenge.
So again, it comes back to international community, collective action, as well as individual action by, in your case, the Netherlands.
Yeah, and maybe add one thing. I think we are, when discussing the Venezuela crisis, where this is not necessarily an issue that we have discussed extensively amongst international partners. I think there could be more of a collective effort, because also going forward, with hopefully a transition in the near future, this is an urgent issue that needs to be addressed, because for the reconstruction of the country, there needs to be a lot of confidence also for investors to make sure that they have confidence in what's going on there. So that challenge needs to be taken on, and you need stability and security to develop also other courses of action.
Well, it seems like in many ways it's all related, right? I mean, that the international community attention has rightfully been focused on a democratic transition within Venezuela, but also how can you help to facilitate that by stopping some of the criminality that's helping to finance the Maduro regime. Embajador Tare, yo tengo una pregunta para ti en ese respecto. Para Maduro, en este momento, ¿qué tan importantes son las fuentes de financiamiento ilícito para su régimen?
Illegal financing sources. Well, I think that in this second round of questions, it's already been hinted at. What's happening in Venezuela is that criminals actually it's not that they occupy high positions, some positions in the government, it's that they've really taken everything over. It's not that these activities are being partially tolerated. No, they are being led by Maduro and the band of criminals that are accompanying him. So to answer the question, the sanctions imposed thus far have been avoided largely by help provided by Russia, China, and Turkey, and further by these activities, the illegal extraction of precious metals, the arco minero. There is an immense source of resources there for the Venezuelan government that's enabling it to survive, which is what it's most interested in, because the money doesn't go to help the people survive. It's to help the people, the government officials, and to buy weapons. Victor, I have a question in that regard. Part of this illegal activity involves his giving refuge in Venezuela to FARC and ELN dissidents. I understand that there are more than 1,000 ELN members there, and I've had many conversations with other people in the Colombian government. For how long can Colombia really condone Maduro's providing a safe haven for these individuals because they may launch attacks from there? Could you describe the situation for our audience so they understand what the border situation is in connection with FARC and ELN people and how they're crossing the border? This is a really important question because the migration crisis is separate from the security crisis. All these transnational crimes happen when somebody crosses a border, when illegal groups cross borders. Groups who are getting rich off of drug smuggling, oil smuggling, and the Venezuelan people are subject to trafficking in migrants too, which is a much greater crisis than we had expected. There are irregular crossing points that these illegal groups are trying to control so that they can maintain flows, financial flows that are corresponding to all the illegal activity in the border region. And we're seeing attacks launched cross-border against the Colombian civilians, Colombian military. Yesterday in the main crossing point we had in Calderola, in Cucuta, we had major disturbance there. Colombia can't be, won't be the only country affected by these security problems. So the question is, how long can Colombia put up with this constant onslaught? Well, that's what President Duque and our foreign minister are underscoring, that very point. This is a major threat, and all the phenomena we're seeing there are going to end up affecting Ecuador, Peru, Chile as well. So things are speeding up. This is the greatest humanitarian migration crisis the world has experienced right now because of how quickly things are changing and all the different variables in the crisis. And with the active participation of FARC and ELN elements, those that decided to go into Venezuela, those we view as criminals. And this shows how complex the crisis is, and the security component has to be included.
More of a discussion on migrants and refugees. Minister Cross, I'm going to go to you on that. Although I always like to break the mold a little bit and just see if there any questions at this point on any of the themes we've discussed, any specific questions for any of the speakers, some of the points that they raised. We're going to come back to questions at the end, but I want to see if I've sparked any questions from the audience at this point. If not, that's totally fine as well. But just want to give anyone that option. Yeah, microphone will come to you in the fourth row. We'll just take one question for now, and then we'll go back to the panel. Yeah, please. If you can say your name and affiliation. No, use a microphone because we're going to need translation.
Okay. Hola, buenas tardes. Me llamo Sarah Hayden. Soy una asociada de McClurdy
And
Associates.
I'm from McClurdy and Associates. I would like to go back to the UN commitments from last week to hear whether or not you think one of those is very important or is going to impact the situation.
Were the commitments made at the UN last week? ¿Qué tan importante, embajador?
In terms of human rights, it was very important. That was the creation of this committee to investigate the situation in Venezuela, and a system that did not recognize yet the government of Juan Guaido. It was an opportunity in all the side events that allowed us to explain the situation in Venezuela to the entire world. I think It was a very fruitful week, the invocation of the Rio Treaty and the growing support for the government of Juan Guaido.
We've discussed, and Victor knows this all too well. Colombia, as well as Peru, host the highest absolute number of migrants and refugees. But Aruba, Curacao, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, they each host more migrants per capita. I think that's a really important point, right? I mean, these are Aruba. It's a small island. Yes, you don't have the same numbers that Colombia has, but you have an incredible number of migrants and refugees per capita. My understanding, about 16,000 Venezuelans in Aruba, an island with a population of 112,000. About. So this group, especially the women and children, are incredibly vulnerable. They're vulnerable to harassment, trafficking. Victor was talking before about xenophobia as well. What are the short and medium-term needs for Aruba to help with the status of Venezuelans, provide employment, healthcare, education? What is the island looking at as those near-term priorities, and within those priorities, what is top of the list?
The migration crisis has put an undue burden on, I think, all of the islands, on our health sector, on our educational sector, housing, beyond proportion. We're talking about more than 10% of our population in less than a year or two without being prepared for it. And we have to separate two things. Most of them obviously were an island. They came by plane legally, and they just overstayed. And then we do have a group that do take the risk and do take a boat with all the risks at stake, because it's heavy waters between Aruba and Venezuela. Those we don't have figures on them. The ones that do come in, that came in by plane and overstayed, we don't know where they're staying either. So what's happening is that of those 16,000, only 1,400 did ask for asylum. So only 1,004 we have factual figures, and we can assist them and help them. The rest of it, we do have 6,000 legal Venezuelans during the past 20 years that came to work. So what we think is what's happening is that the Arubian community, their own community, is hosting them, because we're not seeing them on the streets. Mm-hmm. So now we just got assistance from Holland, technical help from the Netherlands, which we're grateful for, together with the UNHCR. We're trying to do some profiling, registration to know. We also see a lot of women knocking on the door of a foundation called Gente Mujer en Dificultad, which is Women in Need. We also requested the help of the Dutch with this organization, so they're getting some help, especially for pregnant women and human trafficking. And one of the biggest problems that we're facing is that we have about 1,000 students speaking only Spanish, trying to get an education in Dutch. Because our educational system is Dutch. So we have now teachers taking all their time to translate during a class with 30 other children. So education is becoming a problem. We do have a pilot project starting for them, not getting them directly into the school, but start teaching them Dutch first, and then enter them into our education system. Very time and costly. Yeah. And then we have our borders, which is where we try to protect the most of it. So we're doing a lot on women trafficking, on the children's and health. We do give vaccines, so every child gets free vaccines, and we are giving vaccines to whomever. But most of them are scared even to say that they're in Aruba, because they're scared of being deported. Yeah.
And I'm gonna Ambassador Vink, I'm gonna go to you after this. But there are a number of other countries. I know Trinidad and Tobago as well has done a registration system that was in place. I believe, Minister, for 2 weeks at the time, and registered 16,523. Venezuelans in Trinidad during that 2-week period, and I'm sure there's, I think as well, Minister, that example of some of the day-to-day implications on the education system are things that just are not talked about in these kind of broader forums, and so important to focus on. Ambassador de Vink, the minister mentioned the support of the Netherlands, and I'll say I was in Curacao a few years ago, and I recommend a trip to anybody. But as on a clear day, it's possible you can see from a number of islands represented in this room today. You can see Venezuela. What the minister mentioned a few steps. If you could elaborate on additional steps that the Netherlands is taking, not only now, but let's look a little bit more in the future. Let's look at the possibility of the eventuality of scores of new migrants and refugees that are arriving on the coast of your kingdom, especially in this scenario or the potential of inaction settling in and the crisis deepening further. What does that look like for the Netherlands? And in that scenario as well, what does the Netherlands? What's the Netherlands call to action?
Yeah, good question. Jocelyn said a lot already on that, but maybe I think when we started really looking at this crisis, we were actually anticipating that at some point there would be a sort of collapse and big crisis, and we would get big numbers. That didn't happen, right? So it's been a creeping crisis where suddenly you turn your back and you think, oh wow, we have a real issue here. And according to the OAS, and I think you were looking at those numbers as well, 15% of the population of Curacao, 10% in Aruba. So we had a big problem on our hands. I think the right now, and I'll move to the future, but right now, and Jocelyn mentioned that, Venezuela has closed the border. So that helped a little bit to stem the flow of people, especially because there's no air traffic at this particular point. But there's a structural issue because of all the pressures of the health. So what we're doing is, we're in continuous dialogue to see what we can do. There've been various requests for assistance. So just before the summer, we approved back in the Netherlands a package of around $30 million to address the most urgent needs. Now, what we're also doing, because we did that in the past and we've adjusted that, if there were to be bigger flows, we have contingency planning in place to deal with those bigger numbers. But it's also very clear that we've stepped up our discussions with the IOM and the UNHCR, because this is something that we cannot do on our own. And representatives from other countries in the region know how incredibly big, not least Victor, of course, know how huge that problem is and how quickly we've been tasked with that incredible crisis. And it has also, so we need to make sure that we are also open to receive and protect those who seek, for instance, asylum, because they need protection. Let there be no mistake about that. But it's also, we have to sort of somehow take control of the vast numbers, and it's one of these, and this one of the reasons why some countries have introduced controls, and we are also now about to introduce visa requirements, simply to get. We have limited options to get some control over the migration flows.
Ambassador, I want to make sure, when we're talking about migrants, refugees, Victor, I want to make sure to ask the question to you as well. Also, start thinking about your questions. We have about 10 more minutes, so I'm going to take a round of questions from everyone in the audience. But I think really important, Ambassador, your message of the fact that it can't just be individual countries. It needs to be collective action. And frankly, the message that we put out last week, I guess it was last week, at the UN General Assembly on our Venezuela priority event with the Colombian Foreign Minister and the Julio Borges, the special envoy for foreign affairs of the interim government of Guaido, and others. But the fact that this is the migrant and refugee situation is going to get worse. It is going to get much worse, and we don't even have the resources, technical assistance, financial assistance to help countries with where we are right now. And so this means all the more important that there is collective action, that the UN calls for assistance. Not only the UN makes these calls, but the countries actually contribute to those calls for assistance. Y con esto, Victor, yo quisiera darte la palabra, ¿no? Porque cada segundo,
To you. Every
como yo
second.
cada segundo,
Every second, and you have seen this recently, more Venezuelans are entering Colombia. So that's happening every second of the day. At the same time, as we've said last week with President Duque and the foreign minister, that Colombia is a model in terms of its full solidarity with the Venezuelan migrants and refugees. Again, Colombia is a role model for the world. I wanted to give you the opportunity to tell this audience what the short and medium-term needs are for Colombia so that it can continue to provide the assistance, technical assistance necessary to be able to welcome Venezuelans who are coming in. Of course, the migration crisis is a consequence of the disastrous outcome of the socioeconomic model implemented in Venezuela. But first, we're going to need socioeconomic stability in Venezuela before people are going to start going back. Colombia is going to reach 2 million Venezuelan migrants. There are some communities who've seen their population of Venezuelans increase by 25% in recent months. This has socioeconomic implications. This means that the Venezuelan population, who's very young, have to find a way to become part of the society. We need that Venezuelans, whatever the socio-political process that ultimately takes place in Venezuela, have to be stable throughout the continent. And if Colombia needs to show this solidarity with Venezuela, its neighbor, this is important for the productive apparatus. We've got to incorporate migrants into our economic architecture. Because of this crisis, we've seen a change in perception about migration. The model includes the migrant population. This has an impact on the entire productive architecture of Colombia. We need the future of Venezuela outside of Venezuela to be positive. It's also important for there to be a regional approach and a regional dialogue on this. There have to be regional dialogues and then national actions implemented to deal with this crisis.
I didn't get to ask questions about the health implications. I didn't get to ask about what happens without action. The point of this event, the importance of continuing action after the UN General Assembly. So if you want to ask questions in those regards, please feel free to do so. My first question over here, please pass the microphone to Minister Young. And Mr. Please state your name and affiliation, your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Stuart Young, Minister of National Security, Minister of the Office of Prime Minister, Trinidad and Tobago. It's not so much a question. It's a bit of a warning and a thought for us to think about in the region, and especially to Kingdom of the Netherlands, Curacao, and Aruba. We closed, so we introduced the visa system in Trinidad shortly after we did the registration process. And I want to put down this word of caution, especially with the UNHCR asylum seeking program. What we have found is there are instances of fraud, so you need to look out for it. There are instances of persons with criminality and criminal backgrounds who are utilizing that program. Now, we don't recognize it. We've signed on to the international treaty, but we don't recognize it via domestic law. But we respect it. But all they're doing, because they're coming in, and even with criminals, and they're saying, look, I've applied for asylum status. So now I am certain that from the time they jump on a vessel from Venezuela, they're told, as soon as you reach, go and seek asylum, and just say that you're worried, you're a political refugee, if you go back, and to claim asylum status. We need to have a more efficient system, and that's a plea to the UNHCR, that you can't just register and then sit on it and do nothing. Because in the meantime, we, the small states, have to deal with all of the issues you've heard discussed. the medical issues, the educational issues, and all of these different types of issues without any resolution of whether they've legitimately sought the asylum and there's a resolution of it where they're then taken to whatever country it is. So I just wanted to put that on the table. I didn't want to leave and that not be at least that seed planted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'll let the panel respond to that after I take another question or two, given the time. Sarah, right next to you in the fourth row.
Gracias, Marta Lucía Ávila, Hit Media Strategies. Para el embajador Tarre, ¿qué tan cerca ve usted de que la solución sea militar? ¿Aún hay espacio para el diálogo o para usted definitivamente no? Y para el señor Bautista, ¿cuál ha sido el perfil o cuál es el perfil?
What is the current profile of those who are leaving Venezuela? Are they Chavistas who are tired of the model? What is the profile of the Venezuelan leaving Venezuela right now?
That's the last question out of time here.
No, I think the
Please
problem
give
is
your name and affiliation.
Yeah, Rodrigo Diamante, Un Mundo Sin Mordaza. I think the problem is we're moving forward more to a medium-term solution, not just a short-term. So we're waiting for 5 million to be outside Venezuela in December, 8 million next year. So we're talking a huge numbers going out from Venezuela. Are we prepared for this? I think because I think that is going to happen. That is the most probable thing to happen. And the second question is, are we looking for a solution just inside Venezuela, or are we understanding that all other players like Russia and China and Cuba maybe are really invested in Maduro's decision? So, are we playing a big game that is, I think, what is really happening here, or we're just trying to resolve a problem internally that at the end maybe it's not the solution?
Thank you, Rodrigo. President Solis, can I turn to you for the first reaction, and then maybe Ambassador De Vink on the registration? Yeah.
Well, I adhere to everything that has been said about the immigration situation. There's a second model. That's the Costa Rican model vis-a-vis Nicaragua. And we've been, receiving migrants for 50 years without support. I don't want to sound extremely nationalistic. We're not talking about that, and we're not teaching Dutch to the Nicaraguans, so that's not a problem for us. But the weight of having these immigrants is tremendous, and we're never prepared. You're never prepared enough because you cannot fathom what this implies. I mean, in terms of economic development, how much of these populations contribute to the national economy? A lot. Are they an asset? Yes. We want them? Yes. Could we live without them? Probably not. But the costs, the investments you have to do are impossible to imagine in the longer term. So you have to go almost by the hour, and particularly in regimes such as the Nicaraguan regime or the Venezuelan regime, where they can turn up the pressure to get people out because it's a good business for them. They get rid of pressure. So, I fear that the weight is upon the governments. And yes, we need the international support, but I don't think it's going to get there easily.
Ambassador De Vink, could you address the other?
Yeah, maybe the 2 points. One, Minister Young, very briefly. I think your warning is very timely, and you're spot on. We've some experience with that. We've seen, we've seen some elements among those who were registered, that are actually quite concerning. Maybe on the crisis that is only getting bigger. I think. First of all, my point would be I can only stress how urgent it is. I know it's a lot of heavy lifting for all of us, but how urgent it is that we do get a solution for the real problem that is in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. But secondly, you can never be prepared enough. I agree with that. But what we should do, and I think that. In a way, we tried to do that also last week at the UN, is raise the awareness. Also make sure that there's a call on the solidarity of the international community, because it's not there right now, right? This will be bigger than the Syrian crisis on migration and refugees. We need to make sure that what the UN has put out in terms of requirements financially and others is there, because I also see and know that countries in the region don't feel supported right now. And I think that needs to be done, because we're only getting started.
Can I add one thing?
Yes,
to that?
please.
We are, as Caribbean islands, we also, most of the time we're forgotten. They forget about us.
We haven't forgotten about you here.
And we host, most of us host more than 2 million tourists from all over the world per year. We need one measles outbreak, one, hitting Europe, the United States. Do we need for that to happen, for it to become a global issue? And that's what we feel. We feel that we're all swimming in deep waters, trying to survive with the immigrants that we have, but that globally the internal solution is not being taken care of.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that excellent final point. I think it reinforces the reason that not only we had this simulation this morning that you'll be reading about later, but also why we brought together this panel a week after the UN meetings, right? That this we can't let a day pass without continuing to focus on the need for a democratic transition in Venezuela. Not only is it imperative for the Venezuelans themselves, but we just spent the last hour talking about the real implications for the region and with the Dutch representation and others, the global implications. And if Venezuela were Syria, you probably see a lot more attention, and we need to make sure that attention is focused, because the one thing that benefits the Maduro regime is stasis and inaction. And so, and we cannot let that settle in. I want to again thank our partners, Andrew Foreign Policy Magazine, Frank, Brian, Randy, Florida National. You can have time to ask the panel's questions afterwards. I always like to. We don't always start on time, but I always like to end on time. And I want to thank the panelists, President Solis, Ambassador De Vink, Minister Gross, Victor, and Ambassador Tade for your presentations, and thank my incredible team that put together these entire events. Domingo Sarduni in the black suit over there has been tirelessly working to put all this together over the course of the last few months. Working with Diego Adea, Paula Tufro, Angela Chavez, and the rest of the team. So thank you all very much, and enjoy your afternoon. And if there's other questions, please feel free to ask the panelists.